Yeah, hello everyone. A very warm welcome to our first ACIL Amsterdam Center for International Law lecture of this calendar year and the first one in the series of the second semester. My name is Ingo Fenske, and I'm particularly pleased for a variety of reasons to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Doreen Lustig. Well, I'm pleased because while she's a great scholar, she will present a wonderful paper. I'm also pleased because we've tried before to interact with you, Doreen. You were going to give the lecture at our annual research day last summer, which was one of the first casualties in our context in Amsterdam of the COVID pandemic. And so I'm very happy that we now can get together and discuss with you, even if it is still in two-dimensional space. I hope we can do so before all too long in three-dimensional space as well. Yeah, and it's a great paper that we will hear and discuss in a moment. Let me just briefly introduce you, Doreen, to everyone. I mean, you can all Google just as well, but just to note that Doreen Lustig is an associate professor at Tel Aviv University. She has graduated there in sociology and anthropology and continued to her study at Dr. University Law. You don't have a degree, as far as I know, in history, but that doesn't seem to matter at all. You have a great track record of publications. Tomorrow we have an opportunity to discuss your monograph that has just come out on Veiled Power, on the history of international law and private business cooperation between 1886 and 1980. And today you present the paper called Toward a History of Grassroots in International Law. Was the road taken? ? So it's without further ado that I would want to invite you to deliver your lecture, Doreen, and already at this stage, thank you so much for engaging with us. I'm looking forward to the presentation and the discussions to follow. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Bansky and Ingo, and thank you very much for this lovely invitation and opportunity to present a very early draft of this new project. I also like to thank Alicia for coordinating this event and for helping us to make this happen in the forthcoming workshop tomorrow. It's really a special pleasure to meet you all. I wish I could really meet you in person, and I hope that will be possible at a later date. I know it's quite unfortunate that we don't have the face-to-face conversation, but I'm grateful that we could still hold this event. So as I mentioned earlier, this paper that I'm about to present is at its early stages, which is actually a good opportunity to have a discussion with you. And I'm therefore particularly grateful for this workshop and to have your comments. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions and criticisms and suggestion and our discussion later on. So I hope I can start. Okay, I'll share the screen with you. I have a few slides. Okay, so this is okay. So the international legal history turn was until recently primarily a turn to intellectual histories of international law. So while most of the historical attention has been focused on the sociological history of international law as a discipline, the history of international legal ideas, international legal institutions, the history of and theory of international law also includes a rich and sophisticated set of attempts to trace the influence of civil society and grassroots initiatives. Central example, perhaps the central example, are third world approaches to the history of international law and most prominently the history of post-colonial struggles and the new international economic order perhaps is the most famous ones. But there are also feminist perspectives on the history of international law and so many other intriguing things that are coming out as we speak almost. So the study that I would like to share with you today follows the lead of these earlier studies, but deliberately shifts the focus or locus of analysis away from methodological statism by examining one of the most influential civil society movements in the international life of the 19th century, the Anglo-American peace movement. As I mentioned earlier, this is an early draft of a larger project that inquires the history of this movement in the context of the history and theory of international law. And these movements were studied quite extensively and to some extent were considered in relation to the history of international humanitarian law, but really not so much in the context of the history and theory of international law writ large. And this is where I'd like to situate their story. And so this is kind of the backdrop. And there are two leading big questions that are kind of leading this project. And I would focus most of my attention today on the first one. So the first question or puzzle is whether the peace movements presented an alternative model for international lawmaking. The peace movement or societies had a vision of dispersed majorities and marginalized groups, the idea that they could use legal and political and institutional terrains to voice their concerns and promote their perspectives. And this project really tries to inquire whether the peace societies of the 19th century offered an attempt to follow a different legitimation path that doesn't really resonate with our familiar view of statist international lawmaking or a more expert biased understanding of international law. So this is kind of one aspect of this question, of the research question. And I also try to understand why this model of international lawmaking, to the extent there was such a model, didn't prevail. Whether and how their experimentation with different political organizations inspired alternative visions of the international legal order itself, and reconstructing the history of the peace movement in international law, I hope, may complement and enrich the common understanding we have of the history of international law that have paid limited attention so far to the role of civil society and the role of this particular movement in the history of the formation of international law. It joins other attempts that consider moments of contestation, roads not taken, struggles between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forces as histories that are pivotal to our understanding of international law. And here too, I think I'm following Ingo's work on counterfactual histories of international law, and the idea of looking at the roads now taken, I guess, is somewhat part of that project, and Ingo would correct me later if I'm wrong. So this is kind of one aspect, one big question that I'm trying to pose. The next one is to think about this moment as a moment of a special role of the civil society, and it's in the formation of civil society in international law. So I'm trying to understand whether the institutionalization of international law as an interstate and expert bias discipline was also the moment when the notion of civil society is somewhat external to the purposes of international lawmaking was formed. Was this the moment of where the idea of the insiders and the outsiders was actually being institutionalized? So let me start our story with a clash. A meeting that was actually a clash, and that clash kind of encapsulates the puzzle or some of the questions that I want to inquire. So the meeting happens in Ghent, but not like the famous meeting in Ghent that Marty Koskiniemi is famous for telling us about. This meeting, also in 1873, was between Reverend James Miles, the American leader of the Anglo-American Peace Society, who traveled to Europe to meet different jurists and leaders in order to persuade them to convene an international convention that would establish some kind of an association of international law. He meets the Belgian jurist Gustave Roland Jacquemont, who is the orchestrator of the establishment of the Institute, to discuss their mutual interest in such an organization. And Miles, who represented with Elihu Berith and other leaders of the Anglo-American Peace Society, invites Roland Jacquemont to join him and his colleague in the establishment of an international organization that, and that's important, that would combine both a Senate of jurists, but also a great popular Congress, one that would be composed of 2,000 members representing all countries of Christendom, embracing men of all professions, parties and denomination, to discuss the whole morale of the subject, embracing principle and sentiment. You can sense a peace society sensibility in his idea. So his notion or his idea of an institution had these two components, and that the organization would also develop an international legal code. Roland Jacquemont decided on a different path. In June, not very long after, 1873, he writes to Miles of his decision, and I quote, "Despite our disagreement on certain points, particularly on the practical utility of peace societies, our institution will not be directly formed to prepare a code of international law, but only for the establishment of an international institute for the study and promotion of international law." So this letter that he sends Miles really outrages Elihu Berith, who was really the mind and the main leader behind this new institution. And Berith writes back to Miles, "I have thought much of that invidious Ghent movement that is cutting in ahead of us. They will go in first to Geneva and absorb all the interest and take off all the cream. They will have all the capital of credit. We shall have it second hand. And sit down to the crumbs of the second table. I feel fairly indigent at their stolen march and stolen thunder. I really wish we could meet at Bern or Turin to get rid of this old man of the mountain that threatens to ride on our shoulders all over Europe." So we see the clash between the Peace Society's vision, really in the outrage of Elihu Berith, and the kind of competing model that eventually is the one that is put forward and the one that would thrive of the International Institute of International Law. So while initiatives and organizations associated with the peace movement were open to all who are willing to commit to their cause, membership in the new institute was confined to lawyers. The institute was envisioned as a permanent scientific body that would promote international law study and contribute to the maintenance of peace or to the observance of the laws of war. It embodied the spirit of modernity and progress, and the Peace Society was actually something slightly different, and we will soon explore in what ways how. So the question now, to kind of recap, is how did the primacy of governments and experts as the agents of semantic authority, and here I also kind of echo Ingo's work in international law, consolidate into this shared and undisputed convention in the theory and practice of international law? Was the portrayal of the Peace Society that's kind of an archaic vision of the past? Was that portrayal an accurate one? Were its visionaries irrelevant dreamers? Or did their ideas inform, shape, and influence future developments in international law? How, if at all, did How, if at all, did the struggle between these competing visions shape the attitudes to civil society and the chosen model for international lawmaking? So despite the richness and sophistication of the history of international law on this period, the influence of democratic sensibilities, I believe, has not been central to its analysis. Furthermore, there is a long lapse in this history that frequently begins with the Congress of Vienna, 1815, and quickly moves forward to the last decades of the centuries. So while the last decades, the drama of the last decades are related to the rise to prominence of the professional of international law and the discipline of international law, actually 1815 to 1848 and even slightly later was a period of extensive activism on questions of international peace. During this formative period that preceded and paralleled the institutionalization of international law as a modern discipline and the alleged triumph of the positivist position, civil society actors of various kinds were engaged in a transnational project that did not conform to this rigid government-centered codification process. So the purpose of my paper is to fill in this gap in the history of grassroots movement in the 19th century and the history and theory of international law, and to explore the influence of such grassroots movements on the architecture of international law and decipher what is the role and meaning of civil society participation in the history of the field. Okay, so the starting point indeed is the Congress of Vienna, that after a quarter of century of Napoleonic wars, revolutions, so peace and order were kind of finally restored by the Congress and related treaties, and really somewhat contemporaneous with the Congress. Very soon thereafter, we see the emergence of peace societies, both in London. That was the London Peace Society that was established under the leadership of a group of Quakers that became for almost a century the best known organization of its kind in the world. And most of my discussion today would be focused on the British story because it's the most central one. Some of the British organizations were all female ones, but also there was a peace movement that was developed in the United States simultaneously with the British one, which is also very interesting and important. And it was also, then there were also peace societies in other parts of the world. Paris and Geneva are very important examples. So historians of the early 19th century peace movement frequently divide its members between absolutists and pragmatists. The absolutists are those who really wanted to abolish war completely and objected to any use of force. And the pragmatists, reformists, internationalists, depend who you read, they sought to abolish war but refrain from condemning it in all cases. So the earlier phase of the society was dominated by the absolutist position, and then gradually it lost its prominence toward the 1840s. So who were these members of the peace societies? Why did they unite under this cause? What was driving them? What influenced them? So historians really have long sought to explain the eagerness of the evangelical Christians to dedicate themselves to the cause of terminating war at the dawn of the 19th century. They thought of them as a counter-hegemonic reaction to the dynastic aristocratic order of Vienna and the dire experience of the Napoleonic War. Some consider them driven by Enlightenment thought. Bentham and James Mill are very important in that context. Some emphasize their close connection with millennialism. Others focus on modernization, technological innovations, and as catalysts for the inception of the movement. But there are also structural explanations that challenge this kind of grandiose narratives that's based mostly on ideas and depict these movements as a unique attempt of marginalized members of the middle class, teachers, secretaries, bankers. They were middle-class professionals, but not so much related to the industry, that wanted to be recognized and respected in their societies, and they conceived of the peace society as a means for that end. So there are various ways of explaining and describing them. My attempt here would be to, I think a very good way of understanding them is to look at their allies. And many of them were members in more than one society. So they were members in the peace societies, but they were also members in abolitionist societies. They fought for against slavery. Many of them were both or started as abolitionists and then became associated with peace movement. They were also very much aligned with suffrage struggles and closely affiliated and influenced by these struggles and the broader demand of the working class poor to be counted as equals in politics and in the public sphere. But at the same time, there's and as we go along the decades, mostly in the 40s and the 50s, the working class charters weren't the only allies joining the peace movement and its cause. There were also liberal internationalists, those who formed the Anti-Colonial League, that sought to attract the Peace Society to join their campaign. The collaboration between the Peace Society, the Chartists, the free traders, all of that required accommodation and change, and primarily due to the leadership of Richard Cobden, gradually arbitration became the cornerstone of future peace society policy. This policy, together with anti-armament, would come to the fore with the movement turned to the international terrain in the 1840s. So if we want to understand them, we understand them as part of this kind of broader transnational grassroots atmosphere of that period. But also, another way of understanding them is to look at their move beyond the Anglo-American arena. In particular, for us international lawyers, this is a particularly intriguing arena. One of the things that is very special about this movement is its attempt in the 1840s to convene this kind of very celebratory peace congresses. So really, the mid-40s were the heyday of the peace movement, where they launched a series of international congresses that began in Britain and continued throughout different cities in continental Europe. And the idea behind these congresses was to oppose the political order in which Vienna system was grounded and the principle of dynastic legitimacy, and really to present to the world an alternative, this kind of gatherings of representatives of civil societies attending as private citizens, not addressing themselves as representatives of governments or states, but rather as members that comprise the public opinion and the civil society writ large. And that kind of conveys the strong link that the society was trying to promote between democracy and peace. So once the series of that move to the international terrain correlated with the 1848 revolutionary outbreaks. And once the series of the 1848 revolutions commenced in Europe, the threat or promise of democracy to the established elite gained further momentum. And this turn to continental Europe at this point was in many ways timely, but also risky. So it's a move forward in some way for the peace society, but also required members of the society to represent a more tamed version of their idea. And they didn't want to be identified as a threat to the stability of Europe and didn't want to agitate leaders. They wanted to be welcomed and they wanted to influence. So these that many times influenced the kind of ideas that they conveyed during this period. And they put forward ideas like anti-armament, arbitration during this period, and kind of shy away from presenting their anti-colonial sensibilities or their similar ideas they had about suffrage or complete abolition of war. And these were very celebrative events. They were spectacular events, if you want. They included prominent figures engaging in promoting the support. Perhaps most famously, Victor Hugo's speech at the Paris Conference in 1859 conveys the tone and aspirational spirit of these gatherings. So now that we have a better sense of what these societies were about and what they were trying to accomplish, it may be a good point to inquire what kind of vision did they offer for international lawmaking. So rather than pointing or emphasizing their ideas about war, peace, democracy, etc., I want to focus for a moment on their communicative practices. And I think that indeed it may be too far-fetched now that I understand and study these movements a bit more closely, and maybe even anachronistic, to conceptualize the peace movement's international congresses as models of bottom-up international legislations. I think they didn't envision themselves as lawmakers per se, but more, or at least not initially, but more as law enablers and shapers. Yet their insistence and emphasis on public opinion as the key to fulfill their endeavor conveyed their attempt to transform wars from being a matter for the closed club of aristocratic elites into a concern that matters to all. They were heavily invested in the force of idea. They focused their attention on parliaments, not the executive. The parliament is the main arena for these societies, and not foreign officers, not so much diplomats. They advocated a flourishing free press and published essays, pamphlets, established newspapers and other publications to spark debate and convey their ideas. The emphasis on public opinion was kind of, we need to consider it combined with their inclusive practices. They collaborated with the Chartists, as I said, and they included women, freed slaves were present in the congresses, even indigenous leaders were there in their gatherings. So even if some of these, most of these, the presence of these figures was mostly symbolic, and that we might be cynical about it, nonetheless, it conveys their wish to signal inclusivity and a democratic sensibility. They also operated transnationally, and I think that's also an important feature. Beyond questions of war and peace, we are accustomed to think of this period as a period of early phase of international organizations, right? We usually think about the Universal Postal Union as the 19th century kind of harbinger of international law, established in 1874. It's about, it brings together representatives of states to oversee the effective development of international postal services. If we juxtapose that model of international law to the model of the peace society, it might be interesting to look at one of their initiatives where Eliyahu Beris, together with Joseph Sturge, two prominent leaders of the society, launched the Ocean Penny Postage campaign that urged reductions in the high overseas postal rates to levels more affordable to immigrants. So in contradistinction with the familiar 19th century model of the international organization, they and focused on bottom-up transnational legislative reform that would facilitate better communication between immigrants, and so indirectly provide a bridge to international understanding. So inspired by the success of the anti-slavery movement, I think the leaders of the peace movement not only sought to influence public opinion in their respective societies, but inspired for a transnational network, railways, canals, steamboats, growth in overall circulation of the press, sparked the peace society leaders' vision of commercial bonds and greater international solidarity. So now that we all feel committed to this new peace society endeavor, now comes Crimea, okay? At this point in time, somewhat where they really reached the zenith of their cause, the Crimea War breaks. And from the early days, Crimea was a media war in which the press, through extensive reporting, photography, considerable growth in circulation, played a particularly central role. So a very famous journalist in the war was Leo Tolstoy, who was also a very famous figure of the peace movement, who spent much of the war writing dispatches for the contemporary and vividly conveyed the sense among soldiers that war was futile. Tolstoy's reporting to the contemporary was part of this broader phenomena in which war becomes the people's war because of new communication technologies. Okay, so Crimea is also the war when small professional armies of the past kind of are replaced by inexperienced soldiers. It's also the time where suffering of soldiers becomes very central to public consciousness and concern. New technologies, the rail, the telegraph, bring the war closer to home, and the media coverage of the Crimean War and the involvement of citizens and conscript, journalists, volunteers, all that translated into political pressure that governments were very much couldn't really afford. So this could be really the perfect storm, right? This is the war that brings the urgency of peace to every home of every citizen. This is the moment where everyone should have gathered around, behind the peace society, okay, and enroll into their lives. So why is that in the historiography of the peace societies the really low point, the lowest point of the peace society, and really when the whole thing shatters down? So that's a very interesting puzzle. So really, indeed, it's true that the Crimea War shatters the peace movement as we knew it until that point. But at the same time, it also creates the wished for public awareness that this society was so much eager to create. In future years, we would see two processes that converge. One would be the expansion of suffrage and mass national, and the second one would be mass national conscription. The former was really something that the peace societies were fighting for. The second, something they were hoping would never happen. Together and combined with the rise of nationalism, suffrage and mass conscription ushered really a new phase in the regulation of war and peace, and the turn to and kind of a new public sensibility that didn't really denounce war altogether, but required or pressured governments to regulate wars so the suffering wouldn't be so dire. And liminal phase, and I'm almost I'm reaching kind of the concluding point. The liminal phase that kind of brings us to almost home, which is the institute, to the point where the new international legal order as we knew it emerges, is the Geneva Convention. The Geneva Convention, really, if we juxtapose it to the, if we look at the two models that we've looked at up until now, there was the Congress of Vienna, really the aristocratic elites coming together. And if we juxtapose it to the Congress in Paris of the peace movement, we see really two opposing models. The Geneva Convention is somewhere in between. In the Geneva Convention, we see lawyers and doctors and former military officers working together with the government representative and really initiating a new phase in the regulation of war. So it's initiated by civil society, but it also transitions us into that professional civil society organization model, and henceforth would see a more rigid model of statist lawmaking. So did the war, the Crimea War and subsequent war, awaken the public consciousness, ushering the revival of the peace movement? So while the historiography of the field would say no, I would say not exactly. What we see is a new phase. Rather than the ideas of free trade as a condition for peace, in the Paris Declaration, which is codified after the Crimean War, we see a protection of private property at sea, which means that war is not outlawed, but the regulation of war itself secures the new globalization and network of trade. Rather than abolition of war, the Geneva Convention would be focused on the amelioration of the wounded in times of war. Rather than peace society, we'd see civil society organizations comprised of experts and heroes like Henri Dunant. We'll see, rather than public consciousness, we'll see the legal consciousness of jurists. The real turning point into the Institute would be the Franco-Prussian War. I don't have time to dwell much into it. And with the rise of the Institut du Droit International, we'd see the idea of the transnational consciousness of citizens as the key for the future of international law, replaced by international lawyers as the new carriers of the legal conscience of the civilized world. So if I can conclude, if we look at these developments against in the backdrop of contemporary arguments about the democratic deficit in international law, what does it tell us? So what kind of story is it from a presentist point of view? So August 2018, this is Greta Thunberg, as we all know. She then still a schoolgirl in her home city of Stockholm. She begins to protest outside the Swedish Parliament. Okay, here's a kind of footnote to the Peace Society, to draw attention to the climate crises. In just 1 year, her weekly protest on the step of the parliament turns into a global movement, sparking the UN Climate Action Summit. The 16-year-old activist criticizes world leaders, and she says, "The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, we will never forgive you." Indeed, her transnational activism and global reach have distinct and original features, and yet they seem to resonate with earlier historical attempts of civil society agents that rally against established political institutions. Thunberg appealed to world leaders about the grave need to stop the effect of climate change, but her position was removed from the negotiation table. She embodies this kind of clear jurisprudential principle of international lawmaking as regulated by states and based on their consent. The role of her and other civil society activists is to pressure and influence governments to endorse their position, while the capacity to really make things happen remains with governments. And that's a contested issue, but I'm making it a little bit more polemic just for the sake of the argument. The historiography of transnational civil society is often told from this statist vantage point as histories of lobbying. So this paper was trying to look at the moment of the institutionalization of international law as a discipline, whether this was also this moment when the formation of civil society as external to the process of international lawmaking, was this the moment when we began conceiving civil society agents as outsiders to the international lawmaking process? This is one query I'm trying to delve into and think about. Second of all, I'm trying to understand whether whether we see the similarities. The peace societies of this earlier 19th century were driven by new technologies, moral sensibilities that enhanced global solidarity. They were able to forge transnational alliances that pose a threat to the establishment. They were eventually sidelined by alliances between governments, international lawyers, and the rise of nationalism. Something that some may ring a bell to us today. So to conclude, the international legal discipline, as I'm trying to show here, is not merely or inherently democratically deficient. It may have evolved as a turn away from a democratically oriented model of international law and a reaction to the rising influence of democracy and non-expert civil society as a political force in the 19th century. So that could be one line of argument that I'm thinking about. Another, perhaps more nuanced line of argument would say, no, there's a more dialectical story going on in the history of international law. It's actually the history of the emergence of international as a discipline is a history of a struggle. It's not this kind of lean, clean history of the rise of the discipline, but rather a struggle between democracy and exclusivity. And that kind of dialectic continues to echo and inform and shape international lawmaking until these very days. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope this is okay. I will stop the share.